Content warning. This episode contains discussions of a sensitive nature and includes discussions about the medical management of abortion.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. My name is Dee Moore, and I am a kidney warrior. This podcast is dedicated to encourage, educate, and inspire as we explore all aspects of kidney disease, related chronic illnesses, and health. If you have any questions or ideas for topics you would like me to cover, please get in contact with me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. Following on from the Babies with Kidney Disease Navigating Uncertainty During Pregnancy Onwards episode, my guest today from Southwest England is mother of two, Rajinder Boucher. Rajinder joins me to share her journey as a parent of a child with chronic kidney disease, starting from a complicated pregnancy to facing the challenges of a son with failing kidneys. Rajinder's story is a testament to a mother's love, resilience, and the quest for support in the face of adversity. Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Rajinder?
I'm doing really well, Dee, and how are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. I am excited about today's interview. Today, we're talking about uncertainty. We're talking about CKD and pregnancy. And this is part 3 of a series. We started part 1 in episode 109 with Dr. Jan Dudley, where we talked about uncertainty and pregnancy and CKD. And episode 2 of the series, episode 110, we did with Kay. And we talked about her pregnancy as a person living with CKD, having a baby post-transplant. And now this is part 3, following on from Dr. Jan's interview, where we're talking today with you, Rajinder, as a parent of a child with CKD and the uncertainty that you experienced as a parent with a baby with CKD through your pregnancy, through to your child as a young child now. And so, excited about this because I really think that this is an important subject to talk about that doesn't really get spoken about as much. And like many times before, we're not afraid to talk about subjects that are difficult to talk about on Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. And to start with a disclaimer, we may be covering subjects that individuals may find difficult to listen to. But like I said, we do need to talk about these things, and we talk about everything on this podcast. And so always with a message of hope, but we do need to talk about those difficult subjects. But thank you for the courage that it takes to share a story that contains things that are so difficult to share. Thank you again for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm absolutely really happy to. And it's a really personal story to me. And it's something that I really want to share. And I hope it will just help anyone out there to not feel so alone.
I know that it definitely will. So my first question is, how did your journey with chronic kidney disease begin in terms of your child?
Yeah, so as newlyweds, we decided we wanted to start a family, and really excited to find out that I was pregnant, and the 12-week scan went absolutely well. Everything was on track as it should. And then as we approached the 20-week scan, obviously you can't help but just feel, you're full of slight trepidation. Will the baby have 10 fingers and 10 toes, and are all the organs developing as they should? And then, you're ushered into the room, you've paid for your scans, and you're, full of slight excitement. You're going to find out if you're going to have a boy or a girl. And then the sonographer, says, oh, this is going to be cold jelly on your tummy. And as they're trying to find the baby, for me, I just remember it took a really long time. And she was obviously looking and looking, and then to hear the words that you don't ever really want to hear, oh, I think I'm going to have to call someone. It was at that moment, Dee, the 20-week scan, that changed my life and my husband's life. It was huge. It was from that moment, our lives were never going to be the same again.
You heard the words from the sonographer that someone else would be called, and there's always that feeling of anxiety and fear when you hear those words. You knew at that point that something wasn't right. So what were you told at that time?
So when the doctor entered the room, I just remember he was trying to just determine what he was able to see. And there was like a monitor on the wall, so you were able to see what he was looking at. And we couldn't make out the baby. We couldn't even see the outline of the baby like we did at the 12-week scan. And I just remember just seeing, it was almost like a black hole. And my husband had to say to the doctor, because he was struggling so much, can you just switch the monitor off? Because I think we were both just really anxious and we didn't know what was going on. And from having this jumping bean from the 12-week scan to not even being able to see the baby, we were then told that we needed to go into a side room. And I think the doctor had managed to take measurements, but that was all we were told. We were then placed in the side room. A nurse approached us and just said that we would need to come back the next day, and we would be meeting with the fetal medicine unit, and a consultant would be seeing us to determine the next steps.
I can only imagine how you felt in that moment, not knowing what was happening, worrying about your baby. What did they tell you? Did they say anything that could reassure you at that time, or was it just still completely up in the air?
It was completely up in the air. And I think that was the worst thing. Knowing family, friends, I was still working. They were expecting me to come back to work after the scan. And suddenly I was having to think, what do I say to my friends, to my work colleagues, to my family? What do we say? Everyone's expecting to find out, the scan of the baby. Are we having a boy? Are we having a girl? Is it healthy? And the only way I can describe it, it just felt like our world just came crashing down. And even now I feel really emotional talking about it. It was really hard. It was a really hard moment in our life. And I was really grateful. I had my husband and we supported each other. And we went home and we decided to just message people to say the scan hadn't gone the way we had hoped and that we needed to go back to the hospital. And it was just a message to sort of placate people, just to tell them to back off, because I didn't want anyone messaging me. I didn't have the capacity or energy to be able to deal with that. And I remember my manager at work kept messaging, oh, will you be back in the day after? My husband had to take my phone and just say, look, we'll be in contact. Please don't contact us. I just didn't know what to do. And it was horrible going home and not knowing. We both couldn't sleep. We were tossing and turning, and just knowing that we would be back in the same hospital a few hours later.
So when you left the scan, what did they tell you?
They said to us that we needed to come back and meet with the fetal medicine unit, so a specialist consultant who would rescan me and potentially take some amniotic fluid to determine if there was a particular issue, whether there was some sort of genetic disorder. So it basically made us not really leave with any kind of conclusive news. We didn't know what was going on, but we knew that there was an issue with the baby, that the baby wasn't growing or developing as it should. And for us to be referred to the fetal medicine team, we knew potentially things weren't looking good.
So when they brought you back for the next scan, what happened next?
So we were introduced to the fetal medicine consultant and the nurse that supports him. And he rescanned me and was able to then look at the scan and determine what was going on. And he was looking at the organs. And it was at that point he told us that the black hole that I referred to was actually my son's bladder. And it was so full of amniotic fluid, it had almost squashed what they could see on the screen. And that's why we couldn't quite make out the outline of the baby. And I think it was at that point he realized there was some sort of blockage somewhere, and that my son had obviously consumed the amniotic fluid, which is quite normal. And it's like a cycle, and it's to help the lungs and everything develop. And it was at that point the consultant said to us that something obviously has caused this to happen. And what they could do is they could take a sample. So it would involve putting a needle directly into my son's bladder and draining that amniotic fluid to be able to then examine it in terms of sending it off to the labs to see if there is some sort of genetic disorder, just to work out what's caused this. And again, being called back to the hospital when they knew the news. And it was at that point that they then spoke about, okay, we think there's some sort of issue, but essentially your son's kidneys have failed. The back pressure of the bladder being so engorged has caused the kidneys to fail. And I think I was perhaps a little naive. And I remember asking the consultant whether the kidneys would develop or would they be able to recover from the back pressure. And the consultant unfortunately said no, that at this point the kidneys had failed and they're actually quite fragile. And if damaged, especially in utero, they won't recover. And I think that was quite a stark statement. And I just remember my brain just think it almost couldn't comprehend it, but I knew it was bad.
I can only imagine how difficult it was to hear such devastating news in terms of your understanding of kidneys and their function and the impact of damage to the kidneys. Did they explain to you what could be the outcome in terms of his life going forward at this point?
At that point, knowing that the kidneys weren't functioning and knowing that obviously, I didn't have any amniotic fluid in me, the consultant spoke about a particular procedure that could potentially help just to see if there was any kidney function. And that was when I was later referred to another hospital where my son required a pigtail shunt. And that's where they insert, it's almost like, hence why it's called a pigtail shunt. It's like a squirrely tail of a pig. And again, they would put it directly into his bladder, and they would also rehydrate the fluid so that if my son was able to then swallow that fluid, just to see if the kidneys would kick back in, just to check if there was any function in them. And obviously there was some sort of bladder obstruction, but that way the pigtail shunt was like a straw that at least the fluid would be able to leak out. So I had that procedure. And I guess, again, you can't help but just be optimistic. Both myself and my husband, we were really praying that this procedure would help and that any kidney function he did have, even if it wasn't optimal, that at least he had some and it wasn't complete kidney failure. And I think that's where we were at. We were really hoping and praying. Unfortunately, the procedure was too late. And it was at that point we realized his kidneys, he didn't have any function in his kidneys. And we were offered a medical termination. That was really hard to hear. And we were also not told very much in the sense of what life would look like. And I just remember words being used such as incompatible with life, and knowing that my son would be born severely disabled. Also, because I didn't have any amniotic fluid, that he wouldn't be able to move his arms and legs like other babies would in the ideal conditions. So his bones would potentially be fused together. And whenever we did have scans, because we would regularly have scans, we were just constantly told, oh, his lungs are underdeveloped. It just became really depressing, Dee. The scans the doctors would just talk about the percentage, or, oh, this many percentage of children, if they're born with underdeveloped lungs, could survive or they could be viable. It just became really depressing.
What support were you given at that time to help you come to terms with the news that you were being given?
I remember the nurse stamping my maternity notes, because you get your little folder, and she just stamped. It was a name of a charity, and it was just her saying, look, I really think you should call them. And that was the only support we were given. We weren't referred to any sort of local charity or any other group in the hospital. I just remember just feeling very alone, very isolated, and feeling like, how can I be the only person that this has happened to? Because each time we kept asking the consultant, have there ever been any other babies in a similar situation to ours? Surely you must know. And he was just often so vague. So I think for us, it was just feeling so alone and feeling like there was no one who could perhaps help us, because having a nurse just sort of stamp the name of a charity on your maternity notes, I thought, is that it? Is that the best they can do? And just feeling really disappointed with the community midwives, because it was almost like, oh, your pregnancy isn't progressing like a normal one. And it was almost like people didn't know how to respond to you anymore.
I'm truly, really sorry to hear that this was your experience and not getting the support that you needed, especially when they're using terms like medical termination. Sometimes I think when some health professionals have been in that field for so long, they forget the humanity. And it's something that I can directly relate to when I became pregnant with my second son, because my first pregnancy was very, very complicated. I nearly went blind. I had brain surgery following my first pregnancy. And so when I fell pregnant with my second son, the doctor literally, after telling me I was pregnant, her next sentence was, well, I suppose the hospital recommend you have an abortion, so here's the leaflets, and push the abortion leaflets towards me. The way she said it was just so nonchalant and so matter of fact. This isn't a decision that's easy for anyone under any circumstances. And I really feel that there needs to be more sensitivity and awareness and training as well when it comes to situations like this. Being a parent, having a pregnancy that is complicated is hard enough without medical professionals behaving and speaking in a way that is insensitive. And I know this is a really strong statement to make, but it needs to be made that more needs to be done. Absolutely.
Do you know what? Thank you so much for saying that, Dee, because I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, because it feels really clinical. And I think health professionals sometimes forget that they're dealing with humans. And in our case, it was our first pregnancy. You know, we started it knowing that we wanted to start our family. And then just to sort of say, oh, yeah, you know, your pregnancy isn't progressing as it should. And, you know, it's not even referred to as a baby. You know, the fetus is potentially incompatible with life. You know, at this stage, we would recommend, a medical termination. To use such harsh and cold words, it felt like the rug had been taken away from us. And it's such a big statement to make. How do they think we're going to react? And then you're just left like, okay, you've had your appointment. Okay, let us know or come back for the next appointment to let us know what your plans are. You're just left to then just go back home and sit with those big words. It was such a tough decision. And we did call a charity in the end and we spoke to them because, again, maybe there's a certain naivety and innocence to me, but I didn't actually know what a medical termination involved. And when I found out, I couldn't do it. So yeah, I agree. There needs to be more support. Also, there needs to be more support from the community team because suddenly, you've been referred to the fetal medicine unit, you're going in for regular checks. And then I remember when I actually met the community midwife, it was almost like she couldn't go on to autopilot with me because she couldn't ask for this, that, and the other, and have this chirpy demeanor. It was almost like, yeah, she's the one with the problem pregnancy. I don't have a script for that. It just felt almost like people didn't know how to interact or behave with me. And like I said, I'm just a human being, that's all. And people could just check, how are you doing, Rajinder? How are you doing? How are you coping with this? Just simple words like that, Dee.
It is the difference that makes the difference. That recognition of, even if it's to say, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I'm here to listen and I'm here for you. That can make such a difference for people going through the worst circumstances.
Completely. And I think that's what was lacking throughout that whole second part of my pregnancy. It was very matter of fact and clinical. And I use that word because that's how it felt. It was almost transactional. Right, you're here for your scan. Yep, the lungs are underdeveloped. Yep, this hasn't developed. Yep, the fetus is still in, substandard conditions, essentially. And then you're just told bad news after bad news. And actually, no one actually says, how are you doing? How are you coping? Is there anything else you need? Do you have family and friends that can support you? And that's why I've said before, I just felt so alone. If it wasn't for my husband, I genuinely don't know but essentially we needed each other. We were a team. We made decisions together. We were able to cope with each scan, as depressing as they were, but we were able to cope because we had each other and we spoke about our feelings, and that really helped. And I'm so incredibly grateful to him.
You made the decision to continue with your pregnancy and you had regular scans to see how things were going. What happened next?
So essentially, despite the pigtail shunt procedure not working and then being offered a medical termination, it was at that stage, both my husband and I felt that we just didn't have enough information. We were using Google. We couldn't find any sort of peer support groups. We couldn't seem to find any other babies that seemed to have some sort of bladder obstruction. And at that point, we were then told we were able to meet another specialist NICU doctor. We were also able to meet a renal consultant to just discuss what would happen with us deciding to continue the pregnancy. That in itself was a minefield. Speaking to the NICU doctor, he was very much, your baby could be born stillborn. Your baby might not even be in a good enough condition to be alive when you give birth. And not having any amniotic fluid, the baby wouldn't naturally turn. And each of the scans kept saying that my baby was in a breech position. And again, constant conversations. I think at this stage, me and my husband, we just wanted to acquire as much information as we could because we had decided that the medical termination for us wasn't an option. And if my son was that poorly, perhaps, we could give birth to him knowing that we did everything we could within our power to give him the most successful chance to thrive, to survive post-pregnancy. And it was at that stage we were introduced to Jan Dudley.
So meeting a renal consultant who is able to give you more information about the kidneys, what did you find out then at this point?
So that first meeting with Dr. Jan Dudley, that was the first time I'd ever even been to a children's hospital. I'd never stepped foot. And I remember driving past this hospital so many times, never knowing what went on inside. And I couldn't believe that here I was going into this big building and suddenly, thrust into this medicalized world. Jan was very informative and, she was very direct in terms of the consequences, but also the impact, knowing that my son's kidneys at this stage had failed. She was able to tell us that should the baby survive birth, if it was of a viable weight, it would be a case of waiting and seeing day by day, is the baby getting stronger? Is it able to survive? Especially knowing that my son's lungs were hugely underdeveloped. So it's knowing that actually, is he able to breathe? So there were obviously huge hurdles that my son would have to overcome. But essentially, if he was able to survive and he was strong enough, at some point, dialysis would be introduced. Jan was able to tell me information about peritoneal dialysis. That's the most sort of, gentlest of forms of dialysis for children, and that would be the most appropriate. She mentioned that, it's a long road to recovery. Nothing is simple. It's all unknown. And unless you have the baby in front of you, you have to deal with facts. But essentially, if we were to have a baby that could potentially survive, these are the next steps that would potentially happen. But then Jan was also able to say that, when a child is of a certain weight, they are then put on the donors list. That could be either a deceased donors list, or if your own match is viable, then obviously you can donate your kidney. And I think a part of me did fixate on that, knowing that if we could give a kidney to my son, potentially, all going well, he could still have a relatively normal life. And I think that's what I believed at that stage. It was just, his kidneys have failed. He just needs a kidney. He just needs a chance, Dee. That's all he needed.
Your doctor discussed with you about dialysis options, transplantation. So how did the pregnancy progress after this?
So after meeting Jan and also the NICU doctor, knowing that if I did go into labour, they would have the NICU resus team in the corner, we felt informed. But then going back to the fetal medicine consultant, when my husband questioned him whether I would be able to carry the pregnancy to full term, he would often dismiss my husband's sort of statements, because my husband would constantly, and I think that's just how my husband was at the time, he wanted to arm himself with as much information as possible. And he only managed to find a case of some women not going to full term, especially when there's a bladder obstruction, that they would often go into premature labor. And when we mentioned this to our fetal medicine consultant, as I mentioned, he was very dismissive and just said, oh, that's not possible. Blah, blah, blah. And it just felt like we weren't listened to. And essentially, the pregnancy continued. We would get regular scans, which were depressing in nature, because it was just constant, this isn't right, that isn't right. But essentially, I noticed that I did start to feel contractions, and it was 35 plus 6. So I was almost 36 weeks pregnant, and went to the early pregnancy department in the hospital. They confirmed that I was in very early stages of labor, but then said that, oh, it's not, it's your first time. And that's the word, oh, it's your first time. These things take a very, very long time. Nothing's going to happen quickly. So there was a certain, and plus it wasn't a typical pregnancy, because often they kept referring to, when your waters break. And I had to keep reminding them, I don't have any amniotic fluid. So it was like, oh, okay, but you'll know when you're in labor. So I was then essentially, I stayed overnight, but then in the early morning, the doctor was like, oh, when he examined me, I can't feel the baby's head. And I had to remind the doctor, the baby's in the breech position. That's why you can't feel the head. So it was just, I was having to remind people that I'm not having a straightforward pregnancy. And they just didn't seem to grasp that. But also, because it's my first time, it's going to take a really long time. We were basically told to go home and to get in touch with the hospital. But I remember, Dee, as I was leaving the hospital, I actually bumped into my fetal medicine consultant. And I said to him that, oh, we've got an appointment for tomorrow, but I don't think that I will make it because I'm in early stages of labor. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said to me, "You look too happy to be in labor." And I'm thinking, how can someone look too happy to be in labor? And he said to me, "Don't worry, I'll see you for your appointment tomorrow." Anyway, went home, and I just remember I constantly kept feeling the contractions. And then I woke up very early in the morning, and I said to my husband, "I just keep feeling lots of pain." Again, I'd never experienced contractions. I didn't know whether this was normal, because that's the other thing, Dee, that I didn't mention. I had actually approached the community midwives and said to them, I don't feel comfortable going to any antenatal classes, especially having a complex pregnancy. Was there anything that they could do? Could they give bespoke antenatal, I guess, any techniques or strategies? But essentially, could they come to the house to help me and my husband prepare should that moment come? And that just felt so difficult to organize. But I remember the day that I was feeling all the contractions, that was the day the midwife was meant to come. Essentially, I felt underprepared. I had no idea what to expect. Called the hospital. They said to come in. I just remember feeling lots and lots of contractions. And then as we entered the hospital, the midwife said to me, "Right here, come into this room." She examined me and said to me, "You're fully dilated. You need to start pushing." I didn't even know what the pain relief options were. And she was saying, "We haven't got time for pain relief. You just need to start pushing." That was the state of affairs, essentially. That was my kind of introduction to, okay, this is happening. This is happening right now.
I can only imagine the shock that you must have felt at that time, not having the prenatal classes that tells you what you do in this situation. And on top of that, the complications that you're experiencing in your pregnancy. It blows my mind, actually, how complacent people can be in circumstances like that. You'd think that they would be extra careful to say, this is a complicated situation, let's give some extra support. But unfortunately, clearly in your case, that wasn't the case.
Definitely not. I just don't think people, I felt, like I said, I used the word disappointed. I was hugely disappointed with the community midwife team. I just felt they could have done a lot more, and they could have offered more support. I felt very, because you're under the hospital, we don't know how to help you. So I was almost no longer part of the community. So it almost felt like I didn't know what was going on in the community. And as you mentioned, the prenatal courses, I don't think what I was asking was a big ask. I think that's common sense. I've got a complicated pregnancy. I don't even know if my baby will survive. And why would I want to go to a class where everyone's having a healthy pregnancy? Am I really in the headspace for that? No, I'm not. And yeah, and then it was a huge shock, because the word I use is I was underprepared. I had no idea. And I think we had immersed ourselves with, will the baby survive? But we hadn't really got to focus on the actual giving birth, what that would look like. And the only time we did discuss it was with the NICU consultant. We actually said that would having a cesarean be better? And this was really, really depressing as well. They said that because the baby, or the fetus, as they referred to it, had such a poor outcome, that normally they would focus on, the outcome of the baby. They actually said to me that they had to put my welfare ahead of the baby, and they felt that having a cesarean would not be in my best interests, and that it would be better for me to actually give birth to the baby with the poor outcome, because it would mean that I would have a faster recovery, because they were worried that I would slip into depression, and that having a cesarean where I'm not mobile, it would be much more negative to my mental health. It felt like they'd given up. They'd given up on the baby being alive or having any chance of survival.
That is very difficult for me to hear, so I can only imagine how difficult that was for you. How was the birth of your child?
Whew. Knowing that I was on the bed and I was just told to push and push, and knowing my son was in the breech position, the hospital staff, the midwife, I had 2 doctors, and I remember having NICU in the corner. It wasn't the intimate birth experience I wanted. It felt crowded. There were lots of people, but I can't fault the medical professionals during the birth of my son. They were incredibly, diligent. They cared. There was real, wanting the best outcome possible. It was, in that sense, it was the best birth I could have hoped for, knowing it was a complicated pregnancy. It felt extremely difficult, never having given birth before, but having a breech birth as my first birth, that was hard. It was incredibly tough. And it just felt like I was constantly pushing. And I remember my contractions weren't every minute, they were every 5 minutes, but I was being told just to push out of the contractions. I just remember the midwife at one point, pushing onto my stomach. They were trying to obviously get the baby out of me in the most natural way. And as soon as he was born, I didn't even see him. He was whisked away into the corner, and the NICU staff just started to work on him. And then the midwife said to me if I wanted to see him. And I felt awful, but I said I didn't want to see him because I'd been told that he was going to be severely disabled. I was scared to look at him. And so the midwife asked my husband to go and take a picture. And he came back and he reassured me and he said, he's so beautiful. I felt like I'd been told all these horror stories of having this disabled baby with fused arms and legs. I felt awful, such guilt that I didn't want to see him after the birth. But then when my husband said he was beautiful, I wanted him to survive. I wanted to hold him. And he was taken to NICU, and that was the longest wait. We waited between 3 to 4 hours before we were allowed to go into NICU. That's the story of my birth. That was the first pregnancy and birth experience, and it was traumatic.
Thank you for sharing something so difficult and traumatic to share. And I really want to give you some reassurance in terms of those feelings of guilt, that in that moment, as a parent, when you're told so many difficult things, I'm sure many parents out there can relate and understand exactly how you felt in that moment. So you mentioned that you had to wait several hours before you were able to see your son. And I can only imagine how difficult it was during that time. So when you were able to see your son, what happened next?
So a doctor came to us and said that we were able to go see our son. And so we entered the room, and I just remember seeing other babies that were really premature. So I knew straight away that it was the room where they obviously had quite complex children and children needing lots and lots of care. And I saw my son in the incubator, and he just had lots of staff around him. And he was just covered in lots and lots of different wires. There was a noisy oxygen machine. And then I just remember being told to sit down, and then the doctor telling us what was going on. And I could see there was a nurse who was sort of stationed just to sort of keep her eyes on my son. And that's when we were told that they'd managed to get some chest drains in, and he was obviously needing oxygen, and that there were lots of different monitors. And I think what I still remember from this day is how noisy the room was. There was just so many beeps and lights and monitors, but also just lots of machinery, and just not feeling prepared for that at all. And that was my introduction. And just not being able to pick him up was hard, but just to see him in the incubator, he looked so small and fragile, but he looked beautiful.
In terms of what the doctors predicted may happen in terms of your son's health, how was your son's health?
Yeah, so I think when I'd given birth and Milo was in NICU, we were very much, can he make it to 24 hours? Can he make it to 48 hours? Can he make it to 72 hours? It was almost hour by hour. And at that very first night, my husband said to me, let's try to stay up till midnight, because at least that way we'll know he made it to the next day. And when we did fall asleep, we woke up and the first thing was, we need to get to NICU. Is he still alive? That was tough, because I was so scared that he might have passed away during the night. And what if they hadn't told us, or they're waiting for me to get there? And my husband raced into NICU, and he came back and he said, no, he's still there. He had a good night. He was stable as he can be. And then we would regularly sit by and try to just see our son, touch him. And then I remember the doctors would obviously update us, and they'd sort of say that, oh, the biochemistry, or this is looking slightly out of alignment, and we just need to make sure this is happening, that's happening. Obviously, we could see my son was starting to swell. He looked more swollen. So we obviously realized that there was some sort of waste clearance issue as well. Deep down, I kept thinking, at what point will he die? Because I'd been told so much that he was going to be born so poorly. And then day 3, which was miraculous, we'd managed to get day 3, sitting by his bedside, and suddenly the machine just wouldn't stop. It just made such an awful noise. And then suddenly all the medical professionals just swooped in, and we were told we had to leave. And I was like, but what's going on? And they said, we need you to leave. I remember saying to my husband, this is the day we lose him. It was so scary. It felt like an eternity, not knowing what was happening. And eventually the doctor came and spoke to us and just said to us that Milo's potassium levels had got so high. Essentially, he'd had a cardiac arrest at 3 days old. And it was at that point we met one of Dr. Jan's colleagues, another renal doctor. And he came over and said to us, we've got to that stage where essentially Milo needs more help, more support. And it was that kind of key sort of juncture, I guess, what do we do? And I remember asking the doctor at the time, what do we do? And he explained that Milo would need surgery. He would need to be fitted with a peritoneal dialysis catheter. This is 3 days old. And that he would need to be moved to another hospital. And essentially, he would need to start dialysis because his little body obviously needed more support. His kidneys weren't functioning. So he was transferred to another hospital. we agreed for the peritoneal dialysis catheter to be fitted. And Milo started dialysis at 5 days old, whilst in NICU.
Speaking as somebody who did peritoneal dialysis as an adult, I can only imagine how difficult it was for you as a parent with a baby. I mean, that must have been incredibly scary, incredibly difficult. And again, I admire your strength in this situation. It is incredible, the amount of strength that you had to be able to go through this situation. Absolutely incredible.
Wow. Thank you for saying that, Dee. I think at the time, both myself and my husband, we didn't see it as strength. We just felt that it was the right thing to do. And it was about giving our son the best possible chance. And for us, if it meant, yes, he had to have surgery, but it was because it might mean he has a better chance of survival. That was, for us, the only thing we could do. And we didn't really get a chance to sort of think, oh, will it mean this? Will it mean that? For us, it was, we could lose our son. And I remember feeling the trauma of him having that cardiac arrest. And I didn't want to feel that ever again. So for us, we were like, no, if this means our son gets to survive, this is what we do. And again, it's because we didn't know the full ins and outs. People use the words dialysis, but we didn't actually, I'd never seen anyone on dialysis before. To me, these were words, but words that meant that it could, I guess, help my son survive. Why wouldn't we say yes? And that's how it was posed to us, that your son needs dialysis. This is what needs to happen. And so from 3 days, we said, yes, we want him to have the PD catheter. And unfortunately, we didn't want him to start dialysis, but, the regular blood tests indicated he needed to. So he started dialysis without even the PD site having recovered or healed properly, but they needed to start the dialysis straight away in order to help give him a fighting chance. And that's what me and my husband did. And it's only now, years later, Dee, that I look back and I genuinely cannot believe me and my husband had to make those type of decisions in such a emotive point. And I guess a part of me even forgot that I'd given birth because it wasn't about me anymore. It was about my son surviving. And I didn't even get to think about my own post-care, emotionally or hormonally. We had to think about my son. That was the absolute priority. Everything else was just forgotten.
How did Milo respond to PD?
Because Milo started dialysis at such a young age, he didn't ever sort of say it hurt. And he was on PD for 4 years. He would potentially sort of moan a little bit, but he would never pull at his PD site, which we were, again, very grateful for because we'd met other families at that point who had children on dialysis. And I think we were just under the fear of if he touches the cap, if he unscrews the cap, and suddenly it would warrant a bout of antibiotics, but also the dreaded peritonitis, which my son did have a few times. We were just immersed into the world of dialysis, and suddenly we had become experts in setting up the machine, medical or sterile hand washes. But in terms of my son, I think because he was so young, I don't think he sort of knew anything different. But also, I think he was so poorly at that point, he wasn't able to sort of verbally discuss or say it hurts. And I guess that's the other thing. We knew that there would be some sort of delay. We're often told that, children who are born with dialysis, they have a delay, but once they have their kidney, they catch up. But we noticed in terms of Milo's speech, he wasn't as communicative. He was able to make noises. So essentially, how did Milo cope? I'd say he coped with it admirably. He went to nursery, he went to preschool. I think, to be able to do that whilst having a PD catheter, he played, he took part, in life in general, he just got on and did it. And he just had the most incredible character and personality. People were drawn to him. They would often say he's just constantly smiling. So for Milo, he never complained. He never moaned, what is this? He just got on. He had a joy for living. And for that, I am in admiration of him, because how could he just get on and do that? And he did.
Children are amazing, so resilient, and they amaze me continuously and always put a smile on my face. You mentioned before about your disappointment with the community midwives in terms of the lack of support that you received during your pregnancy. For the health professionals listening now, what would you like to say to them in terms of how things could be done better? What advice do you have for them?
Firstly, I'd want them to realize that they're dealing with just humans, just to deal with us in the most basic of ways, just to sort of just check in, find out how we're doing, but to not be so disconnected and think, oh, this is a complex pregnancy. Oh, it's not our remit. Oh, we step back. Why isn't it much more holistic? Why isn't there a more joined up approach? Why can't the midwife check in with the fetal medicine? And if it's a case of consent, ask the patient, ask the person. I would, of course, consented to that. I don't want to feel that, oh, I'm not eligible for community, support anymore. How does that make me feel? I don't feel it's person-centered. They forget that actually they're dealing with a person who is frightened, scared, who hasn't been in this position before. Maybe they just need someone to just check in to find out if they're if they're doing okay. I would say, ask me, how could they support me going forward, rather than just like, oh, yeah, we can't do the scan, or we can't do this because you're doing with the fetal medicine. Why not just ask me? Do I still want to engage with the community team? Of course I would have liked to. But also, there is a complicated pregnancy. Why isn't there a protocol or a procedure that they follow where they're like, right, okay, we can't expect someone to suddenly go to, the normal classes where we would talk about breathing and pain relief. What bespoke offer can we do? Can we make it easy? Can we go to them? Can we ask them, do they need this? Would this be helpful? Or what would be most helpful in this situation? Rather than me having to negotiate that whilst having to also deal with the fetal medicine, speak to the renal doctor, having to speak with NICU. I'm having to deal with all these different people, yet no one actually thought, how could we make it easier on this person who is having to deal with the most complicated pregnancy? How can we support this family? There was no support. Don't forget that at the end of the day, this was my first pregnancy. I didn't know it was going to transpire in this way, but yet no one actually thought, how can we support this family?
And we come back to that thing of support. We come back to that thing of asking the question and listening to the answer. I think so many times and time again, when I listen to people's different stories, kidney warrior stories or experiences of CKD, that thing of being listened to comes back again and again and again. We need to listen to patients. We really do. We might not have the qualification in whatever field it is, but we are an expert in what's happening in our body. Please talk with us. Listen to us. For parents listening to this podcast today who may have received that news at the 20-week scan that there may be a complication with their baby's kidneys, what advice do you have for them?
I would say that, yes, it's difficult. It's not what you expected when you went for your 20-week scan. And now that you know that there is potentially a complication, ask questions and ask for the support, but also ask for the doctors, Are there children that have been through this? What kind of outcome have they had? Ask as many questions as you can. Don't let the doctors sort of bully you into making a particular decision. Arm yourself with as much information as possible. And some of those conversations, they're not going to be easy. They're going to be really difficult, having to ask NICU doctors or even doctors like Jan, what does dialysis look like? What is the quality of life? These are questions that you need to ask, but also once you have that information, you need to think how you're going to digest that information, but also what is it going to look like for you? We chose to continue the pregnancy because it felt right for our situation. I'm not here to say it's going to be the case for everyone. This is a very individualized decision. But what I would say is if you can get as much information as possible, will definitely make things easier. But also, don't let people bully you into making a particular decision. And if they are, question their motives. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? But also, if you don't know what NICU looks like, or if you don't know what a renal ward looks like at your hospital, definitely go and ask to have a look around, because the reality is quite stark and it's quite different. But don't forget that actually, just because you've been told this and things maybe aren't what you expected, it doesn't mean you can't still have a good quality of life. And yes, my son had dialysis for 4 years, but he still had a really good quality of life. And I don't regret the decision I've made. And I can talk to Dee and know that actually me and my husband, we did the best we could with the information we had at the time. And we don't have any regrets. And I just wish I had someone telling me this when I was going through this, that actually you have to question and you will become the expert in your own child. To trust your gut. Know deep inside you that actually, if something doesn't feel right, question it. So I would say stay inquisitive and stay curious, but don't let anyone feel that you haven't got anything to add. You are important.
Absolutely. And I echo that. You are so important. So Milo went on to have a transplant. How did that come about?
So despite Milo reaching the magic 10 kg mark, we then realized, and this is the other thing you also have to get used to, the goalposts continue to shift and change. So yes, he got to 10 kg, but then, we need you to do this, and then this needs to happen, and Milo needs to, essentially jumping through all the hoops. We then needed to go to all sorts of clinics, but we had to meet the transplant surgeon. He got onto the list, and you're told it's called the deceased donors list, but also as his parents, you're tested if you want to be tested to see if you can donate a kidney. I think the hardest thing was knowing that myself and my husband, we weren't a viable match for Milo. So that meant you're then left at the mercy of needing a kidney from the deceased donors list. So that in itself, Dee, is really hard to comprehend, knowing that somebody has to lose their life for you to then have a kidney that can give your child life. It can allow them to begin and thrive in their life. So despite getting a few calls and meeting Jan, going to clinic and finding out if there was any news, it got to the third time, essentially. So the first two, whatever happened, Jan was like, no, the kidney didn't match. She declined it. And I remember getting to the point, just feeling like 4 years of peritoneal dialysis. I felt a little broken, if I'm honest with you. And I actually said to my husband at the time, I said, I can't face going to this clinic meeting by myself. Please, can you just come with me? And as we approached, Jan just seemed really overjoyed to see both of us. And she said, I was really glad that both of you arrived because I didn't want you to be alone, Rajinder. And I was like, Jan, just put me straight. What's going on? And she said, well, we've had a phone call. And essentially, there's an altruistic donor that has matched to your son. I I felt overjoyed. I couldn't believe it. So suddenly, from being, Milo being on the deceased donors list, to there's actually a person who's alive who wants to donate their kidney, and that kidney has matched to my son. I was euphoric. Both of us were. I felt finally, after all this time, my son can start to begin living. He can actually do the things that children of his age should be doing. My son, what I didn't describe was he was so nauseous, he couldn't eat. He had a gastrostomy button, which meant that we were giving him artificial nutritional milk to make sure that he was gaining weight. To think that actually my son could actually have the energy, he wouldn't need dialysis, he could actually eat normal food, he could grow, he could thrive. To me, that was just incredible to be told that news. So yeah, I was overjoyed. I was over the moon. And then we met with the surgeons again to discuss, obviously, the process. And then with it being a live donor, they were able to plan it in the diary. And I have to admit, as each day got closer and closer, I actually started to become really anxious. I became very nervous because I think the reality hits you as much as you're overjoyed that your son is finally going to get this kidney. But the actual process, the procedure, what if something doesn't go right? You're filled with such fear. And the surgery itself was huge and very, very emotional and very, very draining. And then suddenly he comes out the other side and then he's in PICU. And you can't stay with your son. That was hugely emotive. And then each hour, you're like, when will this new kidney kick in? And then I remember them saying, oh, this isn't quite working, but if we do this, it might reactivate the kidney. Thankfully, the kidney, it did its thing. It was incredible because I knew that this meant that actually Milo would have the life that he should have had and that he would be able to access and do things. And he wouldn't have to be put through dialysis. The trauma of that actually he could just be a child again. And that day I was just so excited for. But also as a family, I felt that we'd put our life on pause for such a long time to know that finally this would change all of our lives.
I always describe living kidney donors as superheroes because I really do believe that giving the gift of life, giving a kidney is the most amazing gift that you could ever give someone, the gift of life. And I just want to take this time to thank not only Milo's living donor, but all living donors for making that decision to give somebody the gift of life. So thank you, all living donors. You are truly superheroes. How is Milo? What difference has receiving that kidney made to his life?
Wow. First of all, I just want to also echo everything that you've said, Dee. I completely agree. And we were just absolutely humbled by this anonymous donor. And, we do write to him and send pictures, and I am hugely grateful. So again, if he is listening, thank you for what you've done for us. In terms of how Milo is doing, I like to use the words stable. I don't want to jump for joy, but nor do I want to underplay it. Things are stable. Milo still has regular blood tests. They're not as frequent as they used to be, which to me is another sign that things are stable and progressing as they should. This gift that this incredible, selfless person gave to my son is doing what it should be doing. And Milo is eating, which in itself is incredible, because if you have a child that has had an NG tube and then is artificially fed, the challenge of getting that child to even eat is a long one. But for Milo to be, as I use the words, self-sustaining, he is now able to eat food. Might not be very diverse at this stage. Again, we're working with the dietitians to support that, but he is able to eat food and he's gained weight. So for me, that's a win, and I'm going to take that. He is mobile. He's, able to communicate. He has more energy. He goes to school. He doesn't have a peritoneal dialysis catheter. He's not dependent on that. He's doing really well, and I am grateful, Dee, but I don't want to deny that each time he has a blood test, I am full of dread. What is the blood test going to indicate? Does that mean his kidney is failing? As much as I am grateful for this gift, that hangs over me. I'm so scared and worried about how long this gift will stay with my son. Will it get him through to puberty? At what point will he then need to go back to, dialysis, but also be back on the list? That fear is very real for me. And when people assume, oh, Milo's got a kidney, oh, he must be all right now, everything's fixed. No, it's not. But I think the reality is people can't comprehend that. They don't want to deal with that. They don't want to think, oh, does that mean he's ill? What's going on? They see this happy, smiley child who has the most fantastic, sunny disposition. But the reality is it's volatile. It could change. And I'm very aware of that.
I think this really highlights the point that kidney transplantation is not a cure, but is a treatment. You mentioned earlier that there wasn't much support for you when you were pregnant with Milo in terms of information that would have helped you during your pregnancy. But thankfully, things have improved since then. What resources and support are you aware of that are available that could help other parents out there?
So what I would say is that definitely, 10 years ago when I was in that situation, it was very isolating. There didn't seem to be an abundance of information or support through charities. I know now social media has taken off. We've got lots of Facebook groups, but there are other platforms as well. Kidney Care UK is definitely very supportive. And what I would highly recommend is tapping into social media, especially Facebook, as an initial starting point. There are also dedicated Facebook groups for parents that have a child with kidney disease or experiencing kidney failure or on dialysis themselves. So what I would do is I would highly suggest joining those groups, introduce yourself. And although nobody in those groups are medical professionals and they can't give you that type of information, what they can do is they can give you support that you don't feel alone. So if there's a particular question or something that just doesn't feel right, you can definitely ask the group, but I would always highly recommend having any of those conversations with the medical professional. But what you do have is you have a community that gets it, that understands the challenges of navigating a very challenging point in your life, and especially being a parent carer where, having to see your child be on dialysis or go through kidney failure, it's huge. And you want to surround yourself with people who just understand. And what I would say is, obviously, if there are any charities, so Kidney Care UK is, an exceptionally good one, look at their resources. I also want to mention that Jan has highlighted to us when it was launched, but InfoKid, that's also an exceptional resource. So if your child is experiencing any sort of kidney related issues and you just want more information, look at those resources. What I would say is arm yourself with information and do have a look, put it into Google. Other search engines are available. There is information now. You don't have to be alone. You don't have to feel so isolated when there is community out there that's ready to support and embrace you.
What is your final word of encouragement for the listeners?
I would say that if you have a child that is experiencing kidney failure or on dialysis, you are doing the absolute utmost for them. You're being the best parent you can be to support them, but also have enough belief and confidence in your advocacy for them. And I think at times doctors, I've mentioned it before, can become quite desensitized, as with other health professionals, but have enough belief and conviction in yourself to ask any particular questions, or you want to know more information, don't let them fob you off with medical jargon or terminology that sounds sometimes a bit overwhelming. It's okay to question, is this the best treatment? Why are you doing this? What is the impact of this? What I would say is, you are the expert. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not. You are. Believe in yourself. If there's a particular gut feeling you're having and something doesn't feel right, question it. It's okay. It doesn't mean you're a pushy or a fussy parent. Own it. I have. And I know that if I go to the hospital, I'm not there to make friends. I'm still being me. I'm still being authentic and real. But I want to make sure that my son has the very best treatment. If that means me asking more questions, I don't care if they don't like me. I don't care if they think, oh, here she is asking us this, that, and the other. I want to leave that interaction knowing I did the very best I could for my son. And that would be my words of encouragement. Don't let anyone label you as being the difficult parent. Own that label.
Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I know that this will help so many parents feel less alone. So many parents feel encouraged. I admire your strength. I admire your courage. And thank you so, so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Dee. I'm so, so grateful to have had the opportunity to share something that is hugely personal to me. And it's not something I choose to openly discuss, but if it can help someone out there feel less alone, then it definitely was worth it. And I just want to express that had I had a podcast 10 years ago and heard these words and heard someone else, it would have helped me hugely. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for just giving me the platform to be able to speak. And yeah, I'm hugely grateful to people like you who are the voice, discussing tough issues, which aren't easy. But what it does do is it brings about awareness and education. We're able to arm ourselves with knowledge. We're able to share stories about how kidney disease affects so many different people, from an adult to children to babies, but also to parent carers. As much as I didn't have kidney disease, at times I felt like it was me going through it, setting up the machine. So essentially what I'm saying is, this is an incredible platform. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for listening to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. And don't forget that you can contact me on social media using the handle Diary of a Kidney Warrior. Please do subscribe to the podcast and please do tell a friend. New episodes of this podcast are released every other Monday. Until next time, take care and choose to live.
Diary of a Kidney Warrior, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.